Hello, and welcome to the Water Buffs podcast, featuring in-depth interviews with experts discussing water problems and solutions. You'll find the audio version of this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. The video version is available on YouTube and Vimeo. Water Buffs is a production of The Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. Stay tuned until the end for more information. We hope you enjoy the show.
These changes are going to keep happening, and we can either be sad and full of despair and think there's nothing to be done, or we can think, well, how do we adapt to this new world?
Hello, and welcome to the Water Buffs podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Tobin, director of the Water Desk at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. I'm excited to be speaking today to Laura Paskus, a journalist with New Mexico PBS and the author of a great book, At the Precipice, New Mexico's Changing Climate, which examines the many ways that state is being impacted by this global threat. Laura has been covering environmental issues in New Mexico and beyond for 2 decades, writing for publications such as High Country News, the Santa Fe Reporter, New Mexico Political Report, New Mexico In Depth, and Indian Country Today. She's also a board member of the Society for Environmental Journalists. New Mexico PBS was one of our grantees, and they published a fantastic episode looking at the Gold King mine spill here in Colorado, which turned the Animas River orange 6 years ago. Welcome to the show, Laura. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks for having me.
Great to see you. So I guess I'd like to begin with your book, which examines the many ways that climate change is affecting New Mexico. Tell us about some of those threats and what you find most concerning and what keeps you up at night.
So I think kind of broadly speaking, the biggest impacts that we're facing include water challenges, which, as the region warms, that warming contributes to our aridity. And so we see increasing constraints on our water systems, on our surface water systems, increased evaporation, transpiration, lower flows to begin with, less snowpack, all of those things, which then, of course, exacerbate our groundwater supplies as well, whether that's because in certain places the groundwater and the surface water are hydrologically connected, or because we place increasing demands on our groundwater to make up for that lack of surface water. We're also seeing, like across the West, a longer fire season, and a fire season during which we have bigger fires and more severe fires, which places an incredible strain on communities and firefighters and ecosystems. And then there's all sorts of the things that follow from that. Changes in the landscape ecology, changes in the watershed downstream. We're also seeing increased dust storms, which pose all kinds of health hazards, whether that's for drivers or the spread of valley fever, which we're seeing valley fever moving north away from just, it was pretty much a southern Arizona, southern New Mexico thing. We're seeing valley fever moving north. And I think, the thing that has become increasingly clear is that a rise in temperatures causes all these different impacts, right? And all of these impacts compound one another. It's not just a heat wave. It's not just a drought. It's not just a dust storm. All of these things exacerbate one another. I've been thinking a lot about what it must be like to be a farmer in today's world, where you have a longer growing season, but you have less certainty in your water supply. And then you might have a very drastic cold snap late in the season. We see that happening all the time lately, where things bud out early, start growing early, and then you get a cold snap that can just really destroy your orchard's productivity. And then you'll have a extreme weather event, an extreme precipitation event in the summer, dust storms, drying out your soils, drought. I mean, I think that's the thing that we're really seeing globally and here in the Southwest. It's not one thing, it's a whole bunch of things all at once.
Hmm. Yeah, and as you mentioned, the intersection of these impacts and threats, they sort of compound one another and make things even worse. So, with regard to water resources, both surface water and groundwater, there are already impacts because of climate change. What do the projections say for the future? Is it going to get even worse?
Yeah, we're really looking at constrained water supplies now and into the future. We see, similar to the studies that Jonathan Overpeck and Bradley Udall and others have done on the Colorado River, we know that those lessons hold true for the Rio Grande as well. Some of the specifics are different, but the general trend toward less water in the Rio Grande is definitely an alarming trend. As we're talking today in mid-August, Elephant Butte Reservoir, which is the largest reservoir on the Rio Grande in New Mexico, is at about 5% capacity. And, we're talking, this week there was big news on the Colorado River as Lake Mead was at 35% capacity. Here on the Rio Grande, we're so far below that. And so we're really, looking at that constrained surface water supplies in the future. And what we've seen now 2 years in a row here in Albuquerque is the largest water utility in the state, Albuquerque Bernalillo Water Utility Authority, has had to shift entirely from its mixed portfolio of surface and groundwater from the Rio Grande, the San Juan Chama project, and groundwater, and shift entirely to groundwater. So this is the second summer and fall in a row that this is happening. And, the city had been putting an emphasis on trying to protect groundwater, trying to even raise up groundwater supplies after years and years and decades of overpumping. And, we've really set ourselves up to, it worries me, I guess, about the future in terms of, we know that the surface water supplies are declining, and we didn't take good care of our groundwater to have that as a savings account. And once again, we're just having to pump the heck out of groundwater. You see that in the southeastern part of the state as well. The Ogallala continues to decline at a rate that's alarming enough that, some state scientists are saying that cities like Clovis and the dairy industry down there won't have access to groundwater anymore in the coming decades. So it's a big deal that I feel like we still don't talk about enough in the state.
Hmm. So you've been covering the Rio Grande frequently over the past few decades. What changes have you seen in the river, and what's the prognosis for that very important river?
So I first covered the drawing of the Rio Grande back in 2002. And back then it was almost this problem that the agencies weren't talking about publicly. The first time I made phone calls about checking the river gauges, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service told me that USGS's gauges were out of whack and not to worry about it. And they didn't want to talk about it. Reclamation was reluctant to acknowledge the problem. There was a lot of political controversy around this sort of battle of fish versus farmers. The silvery minnow had just been listed on the Endangered Species Act a few years prior. And so the politics of the river have changed quite a bit in those 2 decades, which is good. These agencies work together much better than they used to. They acknowledge the problems much better than they used to. That's a really positive trend that I see. But for the river itself, despite this cooperation, despite this knowledge, the river itself is in a far worse place than it was 20 years ago. I live not too far from the river and go running in the bosque or walking in the bosque, maybe 3 or 4 times a week. And you can just feel that forest, that those cottonwoods, many of which date to the 1940s, it's too dry for them. And as the water, as the river's drying, as the groundwater levels are dropping, the cottonwoods just, their roots can't reach the water that they need anymore. And at the end of the summer, beginning of fall last year, it was still so hot. Through the fall, it was hot. The river was really low. And you could just feel that forest like wanting a break, right? Wanting to kind of rest for the winter. And it was so warm. Late in the fall, I was finding buds on the cottonwoods as they were like getting ready to bud and leaf out again. It is really just, I try to feel optimistic because we have the knowledge, right? Because we talk about cooperating, but I really just see the Rio Grande through New Mexico as in a precipitous and dangerous and bad situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned the Colorado River and similar problems with climate change and overuse of the river affecting the Colorado. How do you see the Rio Grande and the Colorado as similar or different in water issues?
That's such a great question. It's like these two systems are so similar. These hydrologically, they're similar in many ways, fed by snowpack, really snowpack dependent systems. The Colorado is, I don't want to say so much more important, but so many more people and large scale economies depend upon the Colorado River. And not that people don't depend on the Rio Grande, but the scale is different. And it's worth acknowledging that. But the attention that gets paid to the Colorado River and the seriousness with which shortage and future droughts and climate change is treated, to me personally, it feels like the Rio Grande isn't on par with the Colorado River in terms of the attention and the seriousness and the engagement. And I'm not sure why that is exactly, but I know it feels to me like on the Rio Grande, we should be learning so many lessons from the Colorado River in terms of how people are cooperating, how they're looking to the future. And it still very much feels to me, and this might be unfair, but it still very much feels to me on the Rio Grande that we're planning year to year and anticipating still that a good monsoon or a good snowpack will get people out of trouble. And I think that there just isn't, I don't feel like there is a serious big picture long-term planning on the Rio Grande in the same way that it feels to me on the Colorado.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does seem like the Colorado receives much more attention than the Rio Grande from the media and otherwise.
This is Water Words, a fast explanation of a bit of water lingo. I'm Hannah Myers. Today's water word is aquatic nuisance species, or ANS. The EPA defines aquatic nuisance species as organisms that disrupt the ecological stability of infested waters. Beyond doing ecological damage, the infestation may impair the recreational, commercial, and agricultural uses of the water body. Some examples of aquatic nuisance species in Colorado include the zebra and quagga mussels, the New Zealand mud snail, rusty crayfish, Asian carp, and water fleas. ANS are most commonly transported to non-native habitats by human activity, such as on boats or boating equipment, or they may escape captivity or go unnoticed, hitching a ride on another plant or animal. So why should we care about aquatic nuisance species? Well, they can cause 3 types of harm. Environmental harm, such as predation of native species, changing the habitat, as well as the introduction of new pathogens. Economic impacts may include damage to water infrastructure and power plants, as well as harm to recreational and commercial fishing. Finally, ANS can harm people through disease epidemics, West Nile virus, and parasite outbreaks. Some tips to stop the spread of aquatic nuisance species from the U.S. ANS Task Force include learning to recognize and report aquatic nuisance species, as well as ensuring that anything that comes in contact with local waters is kept clean, especially after travel. So if you come across the term aquatic nuisance species, or ANS, and you think of a non-indigenous species that can harm the environment, public health, and the economy if released, you're correctly imagining aquatic nuisance species. Now back to the Water Buffs podcast.
So let's shift to groundwater and the situation in New Mexico. Tell us a little bit about the status of the state's groundwater and also about your excellent reporting on PFAS contamination of groundwater.
Thanks. Yeah, so, depending on where you look in the state, there are concerns with groundwater levels, just in terms of quantity of water. I see that certainly in the southeastern part of the state, even in places like Gallup, there are, concerns about declining groundwater levels in western New Mexico as well. Santa Fe and Albuquerque rely heavily on groundwater. When it comes to water quality, PFAS is a really important issue. Just, briefly, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances are a family of human-made chemicals that were first made back in the 1930s. There's thousands of different kinds of chemicals within this PFAS family, and they're used in all kinds of household, industrial, commercial products. But for New Mexico, the big issue related to contamination has been the military's use of a particular type of firefighting foam that the military started using in 1979. Used this firefighting foam for decades, which has at least two of these types of PFAS in them that got into the soil at hundreds of bases nationwide, including at least two military installations in New Mexico. The AFFF, this firefighting foam with the PFAS, into the soil, into the groundwater, has contaminated the groundwater at Cannon Air Force Base and Holloman Air Force Base. And around Holloman, there's kind of less conversation around this issue because the groundwater there is brackish. So it hadn't been used for drinking water or irrigation, although the Bureau of Reclamation does have a pilot desalination plant down there. So that's, could have been a future water supply. But around Cannon Air Force Base, the aquifer has been contaminated. Residential and dairy wells have been contaminated. Entire dairy was contaminated. About 4,000 head of cattle contaminated in all of their milk. And it's really been an interesting issue to cover here in New Mexico. We're a state that relies very heavily on the military and as very military dependent, almost in terms, I feel sometimes, of our state identity. People are very proud of the military, of Los Alamos National Lab and Sandia National Lab, but all of these military facilities have contaminated New Mexico's natural resources and communities in various ways. And we see what's happening with Cannon Air Force Base and Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico as the state has tried to issue cleanup orders and things like that. The military has resisted the state's authority going so far as to filing a lawsuit against New Mexico, saying that the state doesn't have the authority to mandate cleanup. And so we're kind of locked in this battle where the state is trying very hard to even get the military to delineate where this groundwater contamination has occurred, and the military has continued fighting against the state. So we're nowhere near any kind of cleanup, and we still don't know the extent of that contamination. And the state and the USGS did a survey. They've been releasing the results throughout 2021, looking at where else PFAS is in the state. And they're not talking about sourcing or anything like that. They're just trying to get an idea of where it is. And it has shown up in all of our major rivers, which is crazy if you're familiar with the Gila River. Flows through the nation's first wilderness area, right downstream of where the river comes out of the wilderness area, where there's nothing upstream but wilderness. PFAS was found in those waters, and that was actually the second highest detection of their samples across the state. So this stuff is everywhere. It's hard to get rid of, basically impossible to get rid of. And it's a real concern for state regulators right now, particularly as we're facing climate change and constrained water future. You don't want to write off any potential future water source.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely an important connection between the quantity issues and the quality issues. And it seems like this story is not going to go away anytime soon, and would encourage folks to check out Laura's great coverage. It's really important, and it's not only in New Mexico, but really throughout the country. So we were excited to give New Mexico PBS a grant a couple of years ago to do a segment about the Gold King mine spill, which turned the Animas River this bright orange color and really generated international attention. Tell us a little bit about what happened 6 years ago and what you found out in your reporting about the aftermath.
Yeah, so in 2015, EPA contractors were working up outside of Silverton, and there was a breach in the containment where water had been building up, and this mining waste was released into the Animas River. And it was shocking for everybody to see that orange yellow water flowing through places like Durango. And it was really kind of one of these eye-opening events for people to see. There's always mining waste leaching into the waters in that region from these abandoned mines. And I think it was a really eye-opening event for lots of people to really see how serious the contamination is and how serious the problem is of these abandoned mines in that region. Unfortunately, it was really scary and alarming for farmers, particularly on the Navajo Nation, who had, unfortunate experience with other types of contamination, including from uranium mining. Was a very traumatic event for farmers and for people who saw that. But it really drew attention to the fact that there are these abandoned mines, that people profited off of them at some point in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. And now the remains, the contamination is still there for today's communities, tomorrow's communities to worry about, and for taxpayers to grapple with. And I, as an environment reporter, you probably remember this, you're kind of chipping away at the same issues all of the time. And then a big event like this happens, and the commercial TV stations go out and film a dramatic event like this for a few days or maybe a week if you're lucky. And the environment reporters around the region celebrate, thinking like, finally, environment news is in the mainstream, and there'll be bigger conversations around the issues. And like everything, it kind of falls off. But now, 6 years later, it's still a huge issue for communities, for states, for farmers, for the Navajo Nation who are trying to get compensation and trying to find justice. But when we worked on the story last summer, thanks to the Water Desk grant. It was really interesting to follow up with people who witnessed that um, contamination coming down the river. We went up to Aztec and met with a family who they live right along the Animas, and just they described for us what it was like to get that emergency call and to sit on their porch and wait for that contamination to come down, and to wonder what was going to happen, and to wonder what that the effects would be. But the thing that I really loved about working on that story was talking to Dr. Carletta Cheap, who's at ASU, and she talked a lot about how that contamination and even like media coverage of that contamination was really very traumatic for farmers, Navajo farmers, who were afraid to use the water even after authorities told them it was safe, because there is such a history of sort of white capitalist society contaminating their resources and not always getting accurate information from the US government. And so that was a really interesting story for us to follow up on, 5 years after the big event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for folks who are not super familiar with the geography, the Animas is a tributary to the San Juan River, and the San Juan River is a tributary to the Colorado River. It sounds like this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, and that there's plenty of other abandoned mines in the region, and we could see similar events happen.
Yeah, and just the fact that there's there's like low levels of things like chromium and other heavy metals that are in those rivers because of these abandoned mines. And it might not be a dramatic event that turns the whole river a different color, but those problems are still there, and worth thinking about what kinds of future breaches might occur, what sorts of legacies we're leaving for future generations by still not grappling with that big problem of abandoned mines.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, some of these sites were mined in the 19th century, a lot of them. So we're talking a long time ago, and they're still, casting a long shadow here in the 21st century. So are there any other water issues or stories that you're working on in New Mexico?
I think the big thing for me really is kind of paying attention to what happens with the Rio Grande this year. We kind of everybody was anticipating that the river would dry through the Albuquerque section. Reclamation and the Water Authority have long worked together to make sure that the Albuquerque reach doesn't dry. It'll dry south of Albuquerque, but I think it was like a kind of like not a public relations stunt necessarily, but I think they knew all along that if the river dried in Albuquerque, that people would be upset, would see firsthand. More people would see firsthand what a serious situation it is on the Rio Grande, and really the drying has largely been contained for many years to south of the city, to areas that are really not super accessible to the public. And so many people just didn't see the drying regularly. But last summer, the river through Albuquerque dropped really, really low, the lowest it's been since the river was managed in a very different way. And they were anticipating it would dry through Albuquerque this summer. We had a couple of weeks of good monsoon storms, so it hasn't dried yet. But I drove over the bridge yesterday and it looks pretty crummy, like maybe a couple hundred CFS at this point. So that's going to be kind of the big thing to be paying attention to for me this year, to see what happens to the river and what happens with farmers. Their irrigation season will surely be cut short again for the second year in a row. So we're really interested in looking at food security issues and how drought and these short irrigation seasons with shorter allocation or smaller allocations of water are going to affect prices and supplies for different foods, especially since we're seeing, oftentimes the way things work is, so there's a really bad onion crop in southern New Mexico, but the market can make up for it from California or Mexico. And since all of these places are being hit so hard right now, we're really interested to talk about now what might happen with food security and food prices in the coming months and coming years. And we're continuing to cover the PFAS story, which unfortunately I keep thinking, oh, I'm good. I've covered it enough. I'm good. I'm going to take a little break from PFAS, and then we catch wind of new things happening. So the PFAS story, unfortunately, will be ongoing.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of environment reporters kind of jokingly refer to their work as covering the doom and gloom beat. There's just this constant drumbeat of negative, depressing news about the state of our environment, particularly water resources. I'm wondering how, on a personal and professional level, you deal with that, constant stream of negative issues and problems that we're confronting. Speak a little bit about, how you cope with that.
Yeah, I've kind of gone back and forth over the years. I think when like you probably I very much find solace and comfort and joy in the outdoors. And so that was my church. That was my relief. That was where I went to kind of shuck off the work week. And a few years ago, like maybe 10 years ago, when we really started seeing the impacts of climate change on the landscape here in New Mexico, whether it was a dry or low river, but really like the bark beetle kills the die-offs of the high elevation forests, and big areas that were burned by wildfires that just aren't coming back in the same types of forests. I think all of that really hit me pretty hard, and I felt like I couldn't even find solace outside anymore, because everywhere I went felt to me like a graveyard, like just a look into the future that we were facing. And I think I really struggled to get up every day, and struggled with guilt of feeling like I was sharing all these bad news stories and making other people feel terrible, and tried to shift my attitude a little bit and think about how these changes are going to keep happening, and we can either be sad and full of despair and think there's nothing to be done, or we can think, well, how do we adapt to this new world? Not that we don't want to, we still want to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, and we want to do all the things that we need to do, but also find ways to adapt to and love these landscapes and be a part of these landscapes in joy. And so I've tried really hard to shift my attitude on that. And I think that I still have, I think the hardest part for me is I do have like a lot of guilt that, we're always finding out these rotten things and sharing them with the public. And I know that I'm making somebody else's day worse by writing about PFAS or climate change or an ecosystem that's not coming back. But I've tried to, either in stories themselves or through social media, to remind people that we do have these connections, and that the best way that we can think about protecting these places and surviving as a species is by continuing to find joy and to be in our communities and our landscapes with love instead of despair or even rage. Rage is helpful sometimes to get you through a story or a situation, but it's not sustaining. And so I think I just always want to encourage people that it is a rotten situation we put ourselves in. And it is hard, but there's still like crazy, beautiful things about our world, and they're worth paying attention to and feeling excited about.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I just delude myself, but that's what I try to do.
Right. Yeah, this concept of ecological grief or climate grief, as people refer to it, is it's very interesting, and certainly hearing a lot of people express that more and more. It seems as the impacts of climate change just seem to get worse and worse. Um, but as you mentioned, getting out there to go hiking and being in nature, I think for a lot of people is a remedy or a way to take the edge off of that pain. But it does seem like it's a big issue for environmental journalists. Burnout and just being the bearer of bad news is not necessarily a fun job.
Yeah. And, last year we covered in September, there was this migratory bird die off, which was like just devastating. But I live near a open space, and was just like riding my bike through on the way to meeting someone, and there were dead and dying swallows all over the ground. And it turned out it was part of this big migratory bird die off that we covered. And it was so depressing and so upsetting, and people were so upset about birds they were finding in their yards and on their hikes. And yet out of that, for some reason, I came out with such an intense love for the people of New Mexico who were, who knew their birds, right? Knew what birds were supposed to be passing through, who were upset about this, who wanted to know what to do. And it was like this, I felt connected in community in a way that it was this really devastating story, but it just made me love people so much, so much.
Mm-hmm. So we work with students at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm wondering if you have any advice to somebody who is interested in a career in environmental journalism. What suggestions would you give them?
So I think the big thing for me is if you're curious about something, just keep trying to understand it. I think that's what is so exciting about environmental journalism is you're interested in a particular topic or beat, and you have access to so much scientific information and experts. You have the privilege of calling people up and asking them to explain things to you. And I would just say pursuing your passions and your curiosity is everything. And I know people need like the technical skills, and more now people need to be sort of diverse in their skill sets. That's just sort of a demand of journalism jobs these days. But I just think like using your curiosity and your love of community and place and your rage if you need it to fuel your pursuit of stories. It's a hard way to make a living. I mean, like we're kind of talking about it, it's kind of heartbreaking, and burnout is definitely an issue, and you're probably never going to be super financially well off. But I can't imagine the last 20 years having done anything different with my life that would have been as personally satisfying and as satisfying in terms of you can make a change. You can have impacts in your community that make things better. And so I feel like the smart thing to do, the right thing to do, the thing like somebody's aunt would do would be like, don't go into journalism. It is a terrible career that will break your heart and destroy your financial stability and, make people hate you and all that stuff. And like, I just have to keep being like, no, it's the best career in the whole world. And if you're excited about it and you are excited about the issues that you're covering, that you should do it no matter what anybody ever says to you. But if you're not excited, if the issues like don't drive you, then I would say like there's plenty of other great opportunities out there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think anybody becomes an environmental journalist for the money. But really that passion is, what keeps you going in a very, difficult job. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Laura. We're really looking forward to seeing more of your excellent coverage and appreciate you taking time to chat today.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks for all you do. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks. Thanks for tuning in to the Water Buffs podcast, available in audio and video formats on most major media platforms. Water Buffs is a production of The Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. You can learn more about us and about water issues at waterdesk.org. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you have a comment or have a question, please feel free to email us at waterdesk@colorado.edu. Special thanks to the executive producer and co-manager, Hannah Lee Myers, and to our graphic designer and co-developer, Jeff McGee. Be sure to check out our other episodes, and until next time, thanks for tuning in.